Welcome to another episode of the Silmarillion Sessions. I'm Dr. Mikael Thompson. This is Mr. William Lasseter, my co-host, and we are finally wrapping up the Valaquenta in today's episode, the account of the Valar and others, right? Other, you call them celestial spirits of some sort or another. And where we left off was with the end of the Valar, really picking up with the Maiar, which are a little less well defined. If we can identify the Valar as a little bit more what we may tend to think of as the classical gods, whether Greco-Roman tradition, Persian tradition, Norse, right? We have a category for that in our sort of a modern Western imagination. We kind of align them. Obviously, it's a little more nuanced than that, but there's a general sense that they're there. One of the things that we've indicated in some the previous episodes too is that it's a much more diffuse, what Tolkien has created here, which actually replicates very accurately the pre-modern or extra-modern, outside of modernity worldview, is a much more diffused sense of personal presences in the universe. It's not merely that there are gods up there somewhere on Mount Olympus or in a distant other place. And then everything else here is just what, you can see, taste it, touch it, pass through my lower intestine, material reality. But rather that everything is in some degree or another, and really in the sense of a spectrum of degrees of sort of spiritual existence, everything has some sort of spiritual reality, spiritual dimension to it. And that's where we get these other things, like a river spirit. You may have the ocean god, but you've also got various river spirits, water spirits, tree spirits, the spirits of particular places, particular things, that sort of thing. And that's what Tolkien is kind of lumping all together, if I can use that sort of indelicate language, lumping together as the Maiar, as these other spirits. Right? And so he says, with the Valar, and he simply says, with the Valar came other spirits. That's very just generic, other spirits, whose being also began before the world was created, of the same order as the Valar, but of a lesser degree. So whether you think about them as angels, or maybe even things like fairies, gnomes, it's a really wide spectrum. It's all this world of these other more spiritual personalities, or what do you say? Personal essences of some sort. These are the Maiar. Then he says, these are the Maiar. And they themselves, of course, have a grade, but it's far less specified. They are the people of the Valar, as though the Valar are the lords, and their people are the Maiar. They are their servants and helpers of the Valar. Their number, the number of the Maiar, is unknown, is not known even to the elves, and few have names in any of the tongues of the children of Ilúvatar. For though it is otherwise in Aman, in Middle-earth, the Maiar have seldom appeared in forms visible to elves and men. So perhaps in the Blessed Realm, you can encounter them and speak with them. That is, in Faeria, this sort of otherworldly place that we see in folklore and different myths and fairy stories. In this world here, this plane of reality, if you will, they're seldom encountered in something like a bodily or visible form. That doesn't mean that they're any less present, as we'll see, but they're here, and he doesn't name many of them, and we'll spend time on even less of them, but I want to say that we will at least name and speak about Melian, because she becomes a key character in the Quenta Silmarillion.
Yeah.
And then we're going to talk today also about Melkor, Balrogs, and Gorthar the Cruel, who you may know more familiarly as Sauron. What is he? Who is he? Where did he come from? Where did he go? All of that. But I want to kick it off here talking about the Valar, the Maiar, these other spirits. What do we make of that? How does that tie in? What are Mr. Lasseter, what are perhaps some familiar references in mythologies, folklore, stories that we may know, that we could say, okay, I get it, it's one of these, right? It's like that kind of thing.
Yeah. To start off, for Westerners, especially Americans, I think it's a difficult concept to get our mind around because of two major things. One is the movement in the Christian church to pantheism, I think it's called. The idea that God is actually in all these different things, which was a direct movement to separate Christianity from the old pagan world of the Greeks and the Romans. So that's one thing that's a hurdle that Westerners kind of have to get over in a certain degree. But a greater hurdle to get over is actually what happened in the 19th century in the movement to what was it? Uh, Beautify or enshrine childhood in the late 19th century, where children were seen as innocent, beautiful, and good, and perfect in every way, tabula rasa, and all this. Kindergartens were formed, and all those things of fairies and elves became the world of childhood. It was so nice that children loved these things and still believed in them, but when you get into the world of adulthood, you got to throw those things away because they don't exist, right? And so really it was the 19th century that kind of shoved aside our ability to conceive of a world that was charged with the grandeur of God in this way. You see before this in literature all over the place. All over the place. You see the idea of the court of heaven, the infusion of nature, for instance, with actual spiritual entities, the existence of the green man in England, the existence of various different water spirits talked about as though they were actual entities. It exists all over Europe and, to be honest, Africa, China, and America too. But in the 19th century, when we had
really a purging of
it was a purging of it, and we took it away from our cultural memory. We just expunged it by putting it in the realm of the nursery only.
We've made it children's literature.
Children's literature.
Invented, and therefore we can close the book on it.
We can close the book on
it. Interesting.
To real things.
I was not aware of that. So machines and industry.
Yeah. And this is one of the things which, when you read Tolkien's letters, and you also read Chesterton talks about this, and Lewis, and so too does George MacDonald. When you read, and Andrew Lang does too, when you read Tolkien's letters on this, he is fighting a cultural battle on many fronts, and one of the fronts is this ongoing still attempt to say that these cultural things are just they're childish. You have to put them away for more serious adult behavior, So that's one thing that we have to be aware of.
Oh, that's really interesting. As you goodness, so sorry. This happens to me often, and I'm sure there are one or two people out there in the world that this happens to. You have two thoughts and they immediately collide in your head, and it comes out my mouth like that. So I apologize. You get a the bombardment. Yeah, is that what that is? They have a name for that?
Right.
What were we talking about here?
That cultural shift that occurred in the 19th century.
So if you call it child's play, you just put it away. It's childish. It's not real. It's maybe relegated to the children and old ladies.
Yeah,
which don't have Tolkien makes explicit reference to this kind of thing throughout, at least through Lord of the Rings. But even in The Hobbit, he makes use of essentially nursery rhymes, or he tries to create these proto-original versions of what, for example, in the Fellowship of the Ring, Frodo is singing a song that Bilbo wrote when he's at the inn in Bree, and Tolkien has created this fictitious proto version of what becomes "Hey Diddle Diddle the Cat." And there's this reference again and again that maybe in the old wives' tales and in these children's rhymes, there's actually much more truth than you would suspect. Giving a nod to then what you were just talking about is that there was a move, even just a generation before Tolkien's own lifetime, to pack all these things up and put them in put away these childish things. It's time for Christopher Robin to go to school now, and that kind of thing.
Yep, absolutely. And one of the things that Tolkien points out is that these old wives' tales, as you said, that referred to ancient lore, when they were relegated to the realm of the nursery, we lost a language for talking about something that really seems to exist. We basically changed the worldview in the 19th century. We, Westerners, changed the worldview.
So then, what you're saying then is something like the boogeyman in the closet or the helpful gnome that lives under the stairs may not be childish imaginations so much as potentially one version of the story. They're real things that we've just learned how to close a blind eye to in the 19th century. Whether or not they are real, whether we posit reality to them, what the kind of reality, but as a cultural phenomenon, historically there was a time before it, then there was a shift where we stopped accepting those things
Right.
as real
Right.
and have relegated to the realm of children's stuff, kids' stuff.
Lewis makes this point in a speech called The Great Divide, which is different from The Great Divorce, by the way. Great Divorce is a different thing.
Two different works.
Two different works, yeah. The Great Divide is a speech that he gave where he talks about how does he put it? The man after the 1930s, anybody born after the 1930s, is more deeply separated from somebody in the 1910s than somebody in the 1910s is for somebody in the 1300s.
Yeah, so all the boomers, Gen Xers, Gen Y, what are millennials, all these people, we're all lumped together.
Yeah.
Like even as well, anybody born after 1930, we're all lumped together as really this time after, adrift, lost in space without.
And it's very difficult for us to try and get our mind into that realm. We end up trying to fit it into forms that we know of and ways of thinking that we know of, we're familiar with, but it doesn't quite fit. So here's an example. If you look at you asked me what parallels does this court of the Maiar have. In the book of Job, right? The devil comes to God and he says, Job is your servant, but I'll put a little pressure on him. I'll put the thumb on him and we'll see whether he cracks. Well, in that work, it says that it's not devil comes to God, it's the devil comes to the court of God. And amidst the court of God, he makes his proposal. It's a wager, and God says, I'll take that wager. Now, that's like, if you're thinking God is omniscient and omnipowerful, omnipotent, what is this ludicrous stuff going on in the book of Job? What is this court of God stuff? How is it that one of the courtiers, the Melkor of the court, how is it that he is capable of coming to God and making this? And then how is it possible that God actually says, okay, we'll make that wager? For us, it's really hard to get our minds around that, partly because of what Christianity did when it separated itself from the pagan world, and partly because what happened in the 19th century. A court of God would have been God, the king, and then all his subordinates, including these little sprites and goblins and fairies, and river spirits that would have been surrounding him all the time. And for a Middle Easterner, for a Jew, that would have been fine. Fine. Okay, court of God, got it.
I know a guy from Ethiopia. That's still very much part of his world. That there's these things around, like that you would see an angel. Remarkable, not impossible, not going to make you check your sanity, that kind of thing.
I find it really interesting because now a modern person, a modern Christian, for instance, will say that's all superstition. We can't be superstitious, right? Don't be superstitious.
Which is funny because what you're saying is essentially somebody in the 17th century, already things began there, but somebody in Italy in the 17th century, or even in England, France in the 13th century, would have no problem with this.
Right.
Historically had no problem with it.
To put it even more close to home, there was a massive immigration from France and from Germany to America in the 1880s, after the Franco-Prussian War and the devastation that occurred. A lot of those Germans coming over, especially, tried very hard to get rid of their superstitious natures, their superstitious cultures, because they wanted to modernize. They wanted to be part of America. They didn't want to be part of the old world stuff. But people that lived into the 1900s, old men and women by that time, who had immigrated from the old country, still believed in certain things. They still believed in the little imp that would do you harm if you didn't leave biscuits out on the front stoop. They still believed in the Sinterklaas. They still believed in certain spirits of the trees or the. So it wasn't. It's a very recent thing. Strikingly, it's the last 100 years or so we've really obliterated this idea. So.
Because my grandmother used to tell me stories about her grandparents that matched like what you're saying. And she did, I think, really in the cusp. And she was the first one to lose German, or not lose it, but she had to learn English prior to that, they may or may not have spoken it, but they didn't. That wasn't the primary language.
You know, another really interesting example. I have friends in the Ho-Chunk community here, the local Winnebago tribe. They still believe in a lot of this stuff. It's not totally obliterated, despite every attempt of Western education to say, "Hey, those are antiquated ideas. You got to get with it." You know, Cochise or whatever. So my friends in that community are like, "Sure, yeah, we don't believe in that." It's like this sort of tip of the hat to Western. But they do. They still do believe in it, at least to some degree. And it's not that they're stupid. It's not that they're uneducated. It's that they have seen things or recognized things. And this is how you talk about those things. You know, you don't. It's not just that there's a little wisp of wind in the corner of the house, and that's kind of odd. There's a spirit there. There's a ghost. There's a demon. And you know, like Tony Hillerman, who wrote a huge series of stories set in the Navajo reservation, he pointed out that the Navajo build round houses, and they do so that dead spirits don't get caught in the corners of the house. They can actually escape.
Eminently pragmatic.
Yeah, I know. So
and that's interesting, because I think our first reaction to something like that is, "Oh, that's cute," you know.
Yeah, it's just so quaint. That's nice.
Or we feel really, you know, sort of woo-woo about it, like, "Oh, that's spiritual of them." But for somebody with that's a part of your world, that's just eminently pragmatic, taking into account certain laws of nature, which involve dead spirits being
right. This is a fact. How do we talk about it? That we can debate that. It's a fact, right? So this court that he talks about, the people that he says, you know, that surround the Valar, that is likened to the court that we see in the book of Job. It's likened to the court of Olympus. It's likened to the various courts of the spirits that occurred in Celtic mythology. Sure, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say Celtic mythology, especially. You've got all of this distributed, you know, these servants of some deity or another that are really spread throughout the moors and the downs and underground. In wells, you know?
There's an interesting video I saw. I won't go belabor this too much, but an interesting video I saw of a guy in Denmark who was showing us what do the bogs of Denmark actually look like, right? These have never been cultivated. They've never been paved over. There are no buildings, nothing. And they're dense. These dense forests of water and slime. And he said they're really terrifying. Despite all your scientific knowledge, despite all your knowledge of how the world works, they are terrifying. And you don't go into the bogs very frequently. You know, people do, and they don't come out. And that's still.
So there's still fiends living in the fens down there that'll riddle you.
You know, maybe it's just swamp gas. Who knows?
It could be just swamp gas. Pay no attention to those little candles. There's not actually dead bodies there. That would be impossible.
So what Tolkien is doing here, I think, is really, it's brilliant. He is steeped in these old cultures, and he's taking those old cultures and he's giving them a new language in this form of the mythology that he's creating. I don't want to say fiction, the mythology that he's creating.
And I think that's interesting, and seeing it in that way, because it turns to me the way that we're even talking about this right now is sort of your Ho-Chunk friends still believe in, or these, you know, German immigrants in the 100 years ago still believed, that still is sort of playing into the progress, linear development worldview that we used to believe those things, but now we know better. And there's these other members of society, because of ethnic affiliation, religious affiliation, that they haven't got with the program, but we know better, and you know, they're not there yet. I realize that our language itself betrays that. And this is a conversation we should have at some point in the future too, is the relationship between language and culture, because I think Tolkien really plays with that a lot as well. But that our language shapes our culture, but then conversely, it's reinforced, you know, there's mutually reinforcing dynamic between the two. But rather, by talking about this as not a recreation of something from the past or replication even, but he's creating a mythology, or he's articulating a mythology that may tap into something that has some sort of existence in our real world, our primary world of reference.
Yes. So
not as something that's before or after, but as an alternative way of viewing the reality, an alternative world in which we can understand ourselves.
So for instance, if I can skip ahead to paragraph down below about Osse, Okay.
Yeah.
It says that Osse is a vassal of Ulmo, the Lord of the Waters, and he is master of the seas that wash the shores of Middle Earth. He does not go in the deeps, but loves the coasts and the isles and rejoices in the winds of Manwe. For in storm he delights and laughs amid the roaring of the waves. Okay, now that being, as Tolkien points out, the elves long for the sea all the time. That being represents something which people that operate on the water know really well. If you are a fisherman, if you are transporting things on the Great Lakes, if you are somebody who goes out on a boat onto the deep sea, you know that the ocean, in fact, the water anywhere, is a really odd, volatile, almost an entity in and of itself, you know?
Or entities, evidently.
Or entities, yeah.
Different regions of zones have different personalities.
Yeah. And how is it different when you go out in the morning to go fishing, you know, on a lake here on a calm morning? How is that different from saying meeting the Witch of November in the Lake Superior? How's that different? Because they're both water, right? Now, if you really want to put the zap in your head about this too, water is not native to our planet, which is something weird, I think. Science itself will tell us that water is not native. It came by the strikes of meteors, water-based meteors, and they found huge asteroids and clouds of water in space, like floating around in space, okay? So water it's an element, even on a scientific level, that has strange properties to it. And probably one of the most strange properties that I've found recently, and this is a find only as recent as 2005, underneath the crust of the Earth, there is another layer, which is not magma. It's a layer of water, essentially, like a spongy stuff that has water in it.
You're telling me there's waters below the gates, underneath the earth, that are separated from the waters above the heavens. This is sounding very Genesis 1, man. And also,
almost just Genesis 1 knew what it was talking about.
But,
you know,
actually, that recalls to mind Jules Verne, who last year I learned was a Frenchman who wrote in French. He did not write in English. These stories are actually French. Although the English translations have there's an interesting manuscript tradition of totally changing elements of the story, especially when they have to deal with the British Navy. But Journey to the Center of the Earth. Journey to the Center of the Earth. He calls into question a lot of our assumptions about what's there and what you find, and prompts the idea, even within sort of a materialistic universe, that there could be, you know, giants and dinosaurs or whatnot, like living under there, and why not, essentially. But he also talks about this layer of water and challenges certain theories of his day, which, from what I see every once in a while, I don't want to say are validated, but there's more weight given to some of these things that he kind of mentions in his stories as current new discoveries or theories that are part of that. So even within a strictly material view of the world, a lot of the assumptions about the way we believe things to be may in fact not be as accurate as other possible visions.
Well, my brother Benjamin, Dr. Urchin, and I have talked about this, and you and I have talked about it too, that most of science is hypotheses, and it's hypotheses that work well. And so we go with them. And so a lot of things we have in science are like hypotheses that work so well, we're going to go with them. But that doesn't mean that they're always right, or that there isn't a better system to come along. And when that better system comes along, things are thrown into confusion, so much so that now you're seeing a lot of the scientific community is saying, honestly, there are things we just don't know. We have no idea what's going on anymore about certain things. Mm-hmm. And this whole thing with the discovery of this, whatever you call it, I don't know, a layer, mantle, whatever in the earth, is one of those things. Up to now, we've had this hypothesis of what the earth looks like, and suddenly we're discovering it's completely different. And who knows? I mean, maybe it turns out that the way that we think about things in a scientific manner, which has triumphed over the way we thought about things earlier as being entities, maybe it's not entirely correct, like we've spoken about. Inert matter may not be the actual way things are. Maybe it's not inert.
It may not be so inert, in fact.
Yeah, it may not be so inert. I mean, I sometimes wonder about it. Well, I frequently wonder about it. I withhold the judgment that we're just a meat bag on bones, walking around.
Well, there are some mornings I feel that way.
You're right. Well, that's until you get your cup of Java, right?
Kevin, my potion made from magic beans.
That's right.
Essentially.
Potion made from magic beans.
Brings me back to life every morning.
So here's Osse. Let me go back to Osse for just a minute.
Yeah.
Being a vassal of Ulmo, he's a subordinate to Ulmo, and he doesn't go into the deep. So he's not the lord of the deep water. A distinction which the ancient world made too, by the way, deep water versus shallow water, salt water versus fresh water. But he does love the coasts and isles, and he rejoices in the winds. So there's this connection between the winds and storms and the isles. And I love how he has this idea that there is a Maiar. The waters are not Osse, but Osse rules the waters, if I put it that way. Okay, so it's not pantheism as some people think Tolkien is saying here. It's not pantheism in the same way even that the ancient world was accused of, though I don't think they thought that either.
Right. It's not like his body is literally the shallow waters, and his soul is something else. He's a spirit distinct from the waters, but maybe not separable from them.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Right. And his spouse being, I don't know how to pronounce this, Uinen? That's right. Uinen?
Yeah.
Uinen, the Lady of the Seas. The Lady of the Seas, a very interesting title. His hair lies spread through all waters under sky. All creatures she loves and live in the salt streams and all weeds that grow there to her mariners cry, for she can lay calm upon the waves, restraining the wildness of Osse. So she restrains his wildness by her calm nature. Numenorians lived long in her protection and held her in reverence equal to the Valar. Now that right there is striking because, of course, it's foreshadowing what will come. It's foreshadowing what will come later on, which is the destruction of Numenor. Right? When they stop thinking about her and revering her.
And living in the shallows around the land of Numenor, and or traversing between there and the shallows of Middle-earth, when they try and set out into the deep to traverse the boundary towards the land of the gods, which is, of course, we'll get there when we get there. That's chapters ahead. So that's interesting. The Numenorians lived long in her protection and held her in reverence equal to the Valar. She is the so here, even with the Maiar, then we've got a spousal couple. The few that we know, there's at least that. So you've got a masculine and a feminine coupling again in the shallows of the seas, which this ties right at, and we all know. I think we've mentioned before, even too, somebody like Goldberry, Riverwoman's daughter. That Riverwoman is not just a poetic thing, but is not just a poetic device on the part of Tom Bombadil or whatever. It's not just a title that he gives his wife in kind of a charmy, sing-songy way, but he's talking about she's actually the daughter of Riverwoman or Winona in the Tale of Hiawatha kind of tradition, let's call it. But that there's a real personage there, and there would be equivalent. So we know, we don't necessarily know a name, but there's a reference, there's a nod towards some of these creatures diffused throughout reality. There's another point, I think it was interesting to talk about the sea being otherworldly, water itself as an element, being somehow literally planted on the earth from the heavens, let us say, that direction, up above the skies. Is that immediately following this, Melkor seems to work his way into all the good parts of this chapter, which is just what he actually does as a character. It's interesting. He says, Melkor hated the sea, for he could not subdue it. It's the one element he couldn't bend, break, manufacture to his will. He couldn't hold it and do something with it. It is said that in the making of Arda, he endeavored to draw Osse to his allegiance, the Lord of the Shallows, right? Draw him to his allegiance, promising to him all the realm of the power of Ulmo if he would but serve him. So it was that long ago there arose great tumults in the sea that wrought ruin in the lands. But Weenan, so it seems to imply then that Osse kind of toyed with the idea. Right. I'm kind of toyed with the idea of joining Melkor, but Ween, his wife, at the prayer of Aule, restrained Osse and brought him before Ulmo. And he had to fess up. They had to come to Ulmo talk. And and then for the most part he remained faithful, but he still likes to delight in violent ragings, as the waves at the shores do.
Yep.
Tsunamis happen from time to time.
Yep.
We just got to let a little bit of that out.
Mm.
That's interesting.
So yeah, let me pause on that, dwell on that for just a minute if I can. We can read these characters in a number of different ways. One of the ways to read them is a sort of critique of the modern, and I think that's a decent way to read it. And in that sense, we've talked about how Melkor and his subordinate Gorthar are sort of that modernist way of seeing everything as resources to be built up for the use of power.
Right. Material that I can manufacture into something.
Yeah, right. And this is interesting because for so many years, people have been trying to harness the power of the sea as a source of energy. Haven't done it yet. Dams have been made of rivers, right? Tidal machines have been created that harness the power of the ingoing and outgoing tide, but the deep sea has never been bent to the will of the modern world, the commodity of mentality of the modern world. So it's almost like Osse, the coastal regions, if you will, has been to some degree subdued or captured, but still defies. He still breaks free. You can't.
Something of a vassal, but borderlands could go either way.
Yes, right.
But yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
And even there, I mean, Tolkien wouldn't have known about this necessarily, but we know now that there have been movements of the ocean that are tremendous. I mean, these recent findings of floods that have occurred in North America, for instance, the ancient glacial floods, or for instance, this inland sea. I was just watching a video on this. Which I don't remember the name of it exactly, but there was an inland sea, and this thing stretched from the Straits of Gibraltar all the way to the mountains in China. All the way to the mountains.
I mean, it went all across the stands. Right?
Do you remember the name of this? Yeah, exactly.
It was something hard to pronounce. It didn't stick in my head. But
it was huge. It was the biggest inland sea known to man, and there were whales in this thing. You know, it was just this massive. Here it is, Peretethys. Yeah, Peretethys, and it was massive. It was just this enormous inland sea, and if it drained eventually, and then the Black Sea and the Caspian and the Mediterranean and all that were formed from it. If we're talking about the attempt to control the ocean, how do you control that sort of thing? These massive movements of water and these 2-mile-high waves that sweep across North America. How do you control those things? The whole modern idea of make everything into a power generating turbine. You can't do it, right? You can't do it.
No.
So the power that Osse has, and the power that even his master has, they cannot be overcome. Ulmo cannot be overcome by the machinations of Melkor, which I find it's an interesting concept.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Numenoreans, who do, sorry, spoiler alert, who do fall to the wiles of Sauron, of Melkor. Was it Melkor or Sauron? I forget, but anyway.
It's Sauron, under the guise of one of his other AKAs is a benevolent technocrat who's going to help them, help empower them, and then teach them that maybe they can actually go head to head with the gods.
Okay. Yeah, even they get washed away in this Atlantean
by the deep sea.
Yeah, by the deep sea. Yeah, which brings up to some degree, brings up the image of baptism itself and the washing away by the waters.
Washing away of such things. Oh, I think that's very cool. And now, we're running short on time, but we need to mention at least one of the Maiar who plays an even bigger role than Gandalf and others like him in the fate of Middle-earth.
Mm.
And it's sort of ambiguous, I should say, at least too, that the Ishtari, the wizards, where they stand and things, because they're clearly embodied and they interact in a way with the world, but we do know that they come from outside of the world, and so they are, properly speaking, within this broader category of spirits that came with the Valar into the world, but somehow maybe entered at a later date. We don't know. Fangorn himself, Treebeard, tells us he doesn't know exactly when they showed up, but they did, and they came from outside. But we got this one Maya, and her name is Melian, and she plays a pivotal role throughout a good chunk of the Silmarillion. We'll see her in the early stages and beginnings, because she actually marries one of the early lords of the elves.
Mm.
They fall in love, and very, very beautiful story. When we get to that episode, they actually get frozen in time for like an age or something like that, and then they waken again, and they become espoused. And so somehow these other spiritual creatures are somehow able to actually intermarry with, at least on this one rare, this unique occasion, marries an elf lord, and from that is sprung Luthien Tinuviel.
Mm.
Right? She's half divine in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if we understand gods as not one static rank, but any of these these what is the word I'm looking for? But these personified these spirits that have personality, these spiritual personalities, then Luthien Tinuviel is half goddess and half elf. And so then, which then works its way into Aragorn's line, and so on and so forth. So there's all this interplay back and forth of that. But there's more than just being half elven, half human. There's also being half goddess, half elf.
Goddess.
Right? Which isn't a bad resume, we really think about it. But Melian was the name of one particular Maya who served both Vana and Este, Valar that we've mentioned before. She dwelt long in Lorien, which you remember is the that forest of dreams and healing and rest, and the nightingales sang about her wherever she went. But she also is the mentor, teacher, mistress of Galadriel. So when we see Galadriel, everything we know about Galadriel, that makes Galadriel the wonderful, beautiful white lady of the wood of Lothlorien that she is, she learned from Melian. She's not only the possessor of a ring, but she learned all of this ages ago from Melian, this goddess, who she really took under her wing. Because young Galadriel is very different, but we'll see her later.
Right.
In Silmarillion.
Right.
But Melian, much is told of her in the Quenta Silmarillion. But we don't hear much about this other Maiar who's mentioned here, which is Olorien. He dwelt in Lorien, and he learned pity and patience. He's the wisest of the Maiar, but we don't really know anything about him. He doesn't show up in the lore of the elves. He's just omnipresent behind the scenes, but he's not articulated. He's not articulated.
Yeah. That image that you brought up of the connection between elves and gods and the intermingling of the two is really fascinating as well. Because if we do hold that there is a spiritual realm and we hold that there's a material realm, how do the two intersect? How do they work with one another? Is the spirit just a juice that's poured into the meat, or is it an illusion that the meat conjures, or is the meat the illusion that needs to be gotten rid of so the spirit can be released, or are the two like at the same time in the same place? It's very interesting interaction between the two, and one of the things that comes up is the Platonic idea. The Platonic idea that matter is music solidified.
Mm-hmm.
You see this all over Platonic thought, that music actually takes on certain shapes that then cool and become matter itself. And in our story here, Melkor hates that original music. So he also would hate the matter that is formed from that music.
Yeah.
And so what Tolkien seems to be pointing out when he talks about him hating the ocean which, by the way, is matter, but it isn't until it becomes ice. It's not
It's
solidified.
more spiritual
It's more
matter in that
spiritual.
it's
Yeah,
fluidity to it.
right.
Yeah, it's
Fluidity.
more like breath, right? It's more like breath, which is what the word
Right.
spirit.
That's true. Yeah, it's more like breath. Melkor would want to turn all that solidified song into commerce itself, into resources for power, as we pointed out earlier.
Right.
But this image of Melion, who does get intermingled with or is connected to the elvish line, is a classic example. Tolkien talking about how the spiritual, the divine realm of the Maiar, is not entirely separable from the physical world, which is the elvish.
Right.
But it's not. It's more of a family connection, if you will, than it is a scientifically explained connection. Does that make sense?
think, and that's exactly, yes, yeah, and he really shies away from, and intentionally so, and I wouldn't say shying away, he avoids sort this really, 18th, 19th century model, British, ostensibly British over others, model of the strict categorization. Like, where is the exact boundary, for
Yeah.
instance, between Osse's realm and Ulmo's realm? Like, where's the boundary? Where's the frontier? Target could put a sign, you could cross it, or we shoot you, that kind of thing. Where is it? He avoids that kind of stuff. You don't see that. That is coming from the modern West that we live in, where everything is hyper taxonomized, both of those, both identified and made. He follows a more poetic line, a more organic. It's more the model of a tree. It's
Right.
a tree wrapped with ivy or holly or mistletoe. Where does one begin, the other end? Yes, there's a definite point, but really there's a lot of melding and at least hard to see where the boundaries lie with some of these things. And I think that's intentional to show this interlocking, this interweaving relationship between them. I think it's exactly right that's something I would say is something we should have in the forefront of our minds, looking through then, especially these early chapters of the Silmarillion, the Quenta Silmarillion proper, about the relationship between the Valar and material, created matter, and between the Maya and the elves, and between the elves and the men, and man and the elements, and sort of a cascading way. That there's a lot of this flow between these different levels of authority, of power, reality.
I would take it a step further, and I know we perhaps should end on this. Maybe we bump the enemies part to the next chapter because he starts with warfare anyway. But
we actually see him in action there, yeah.
But I would take it a step further and say I think part of the appeal of Tolkien and part of the function of his works that he probably intended was to unlock the mind from that modernist way of looking at the world. It's a bureaucratic enlightenment thing to want to find these boundaries and say definitely this is where it is, and pigeonhole everything, and this is definitely divine and that's definitely mortal. I think what he's doing to some degree here is he's saying these things are not. There's a blend between these. The world is charged with the grandeur of God, as Hopkins says. This is what the grandeur is, and we're trying to open you up, reader, to the idea that everything around you is part of this song, is part of this divine realm. I think,
as he says to Gimli in a really trite way, I think the same truth of, you're beset with perils, Gimli, son of Gloin. You yourself are perilous after your own fashion.
yeah, right.
There's perils all around you. That instead of perils, you could say spiritual world.
Yes. Yes. And as much as we want to think that we're just dealing with matter, we are dealing all the time with spiritual forces. So much so that to say that we are in a spiritual war daily is not just semantics. It's not just a metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
It's a reality, I think Tolkien would say. We are in a spiritual war. When we get on the internet, when we read something and don't read something else, when we create art versus creating chaos, when we talk kindly to people and bolster them up versus when we overload them with ideas and facts and put them down, we are constantly involved in a spiritual war, which is a spiritual war that's been going on Well, pretty much from the beginning.
As we'll see from the beginning of days, it's been going on from the beginning of the
From the
days.
beginning. Yeah, you're just
Yeah.
very. I like you very much, Mr. Baggins, but you're a very small person in a very big world.
Yes. And that, he says, and I just because I cheated and I flipped ahead a page, almost by accident, if accident you want to call it. The first line of the chapter, the beginning of days, the Quenta Silmarillion, is, "It is told among the wise that the first war began before Arda was full shaped."
Mm.
Yes, spiritual war. That's the first proper noun in the Quenta Silmarillion. Is that there was war.
That's an
Something
interesting
that's been
point. We should dwell on that for about an hour.
that we should, as we are wont to do, and that'll be the great spot to talk a little bit more about Melkor. How does he fit into all this? Because then we'll see him in action. And what do we make of Gorthauer the Cruel?
Gorthauer. Now, why does Melkor hate the ocean? What's up with that?
Yeah. Never learned to swim.
Yeah, probably. Well, thank you, Dr. Thompson. It's been a great discussion today, as usual.
Thank you, Mr. Lasseter.
Blessings to you in all that you're doing in the near future. I know it's a tumultuous time, but boy, is it ever fun to be alive, right?
Yeah, just ride the waves, man.
Ride the waves, man. Hang loose. Farewell wherever you fare to. Ares receive you at the journey's end.
And may the wind under your wings bear you to where the sun sails and the moon walks. Just like Arendelle. You get both that way.